The desert stretched endlessly under a relentless sun, its sands shimmering like molten gold and its silence pressing down like a physical weight. This was the world of the hermit, a man who had chosen or perhaps been forced into decades of solitude. For years he had lived alone, far from towns, neighbors, or anyone who might disturb the careful rhythm of his life. His small homestead was a modest cluster of stone and adobe buildings, barely more than shelters against the scorching days and bitter nights. Surrounding it, the desert sprawled in all directions, dotted with sparse vegetation and jagged rocks. Despite its harshness, he found a strange beauty in this solitude, a connection to the land that others might never understand. The man himself was a product of this unforgiving landscape. Weathered and lean, his skin tanned to a deep bronze by the sun, he moved with quiet efficiency, a man honed by years of self-reliance. His beard had grown long and untrimmed, and his eyes, though sharp, carried a distant sadness, a reflection of a life that had once held companionship, laughter, and perhaps love, but had ended in loss and betrayal. Those memories were buried deep, only surfacing in the quiet moments of dawn or the stillness of night. When the wind whispered through the rocks and the desert seemed to listen, life in isolation required constant vigilance and careful planning. The hermit's days were ruled by routine. Before the sun climbed too high, he would check his small water collection system, ensuring the troughs were filled and the wells maintained. Water was life, and every drop was precious in a place where thirst could be fatal. Later, he would tend to the meager garden he had cultivated desert-hardy plants that somehow thrived under his care, providing vegetables and herbs that supplemented the sparse food he had stored. He hunted when necessary, relying on traps and keen observation rather than the arrogance of overconfidence, always respecting the delicate balance of the land that had become his only companion. Though the hermit had chosen this life, it had not been easy. Loneliness was a constant, gnawing presence, a shadow that clung to him even as he carried out his daily tasks. Sometimes he spoke aloud to the wind, as if the desert itself could listen and respond. Other times he allowed himself to simply sit in silence, staring at the horizon, imagining a world beyond the dunes, a world he had left behind and would likely never return to. Yet, even in solitude, he had created small comforts, a hammock strung between two rocky outcrops, a journal filled with observations of the desert wildlife, and a fire pit where he would cook the little he gathered. These small rituals gave structure to a life that might otherwise have slipped into despair. This part of the story sets the emotional tone, establishing both the physical and psychological landscape of the hermit. Readers understand not only the harshness of the desert, but also the depth of the man's isolation. His connection to the land mirrors his inner life, resilient, self-contained, yet deeply lonely. It is a world where every decision carries weight, where the absence of human contact has sharpened his senses and instincts, and where his life, though solitary, has a quiet, austere beauty as the sun climbs higher and the wind scours the desert sands. The hermit moves with practiced precision, unaware that this long-established rhythm of solitude is about to be interrupted. The peaceful, predictable monotony of his life is about to be shattered by a presence he could not have imagined, a disruption that will test not only his survival skills, but the very walls around his heart. In these early moments, the stage is set for the extraordinary event that will change the course of his existence. The arrival of two towering Apache sisters, thirsty travelers whose unexpected appearance will crack open the doors of his self-imposed isolation. The desert had settled into its harsh afternoon rhythm, with heat radiating off the sands and the sun beating down relentlessly. The hermit moved methodically around his small homestead, repairing the water trough that had sprung a leak, muttering softly to himself about the importance of preserving every drop of water. His life, as usual, was quiet and controlled, governed by necessity and shaped by decades of solitary existence. Yet even as he worked, a shadow flickered across the horizon, an anomaly in the endless waves of sand that he had long considered his domain. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the light, a mirage or a wandering hawk casting a shadow. But as the shape drew nearer, it became clear that it was no illusion. Two figures emerged, walking steadily but with a deliberate grace that marked them as seasoned travelers. They were unusually tall, imposing, and immediately drew the hermit's attention. The closer they came, the more he could see their distinct features, strong jawlines, piercing eyes, and an aura of quiet authority that seemed to command the desert itself. These were no ordinary wanderers. When they finally reached the edge of his property, they called out in a calm, measured tone, their voices carrying across the barren landscape. "Please, we need water." The simplicity of the request struck him, but also carried an unspoken strength. The hermit, unused to interaction after years of isolation, froze for a moment. Suspicion surged through him. Strangers in the desert could be dangerous bandits, opportunists, or worse. His first instinct was to retreat inside, to close the door on this intrusion, to protect the fragile sanctuary he had built over years of solitude, but something about the sisters' demeanor disarmed him. There was no arrogance in their stance, no hint of threat. Instead, their posture and expression spoke of endurance, of a journey that had tested their limits and yet left them unbowed. One sister, the taller of the two, stepped forward slightly, holding a small gourd in her hands as though to demonstrate her peaceful intent. The other remained slightly behind, scanning the surroundings with calm vigilance, her eyes sharp but not hostile. They were imposing, yes, but not menacing. They exuded strength tempered with respect. After a tense moment of hesitation, the hermit opened the door just enough to speak through the crack. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice cautious but not unkind. "The desert is unforgiving. It's dangerous for travelers." The sisters explained simply. They had been journeying across the desert and had run out of water. They were not here to steal or cause trouble. They were seeking basic survival. Their honesty and composure began to chip away at his instinctive wariness. Finally, after a long pause, he made a decision. He motioned for them to follow him inside, leading them to his water supply. Every movement felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, pouring water into their containers, ensuring they had enough to quench their thirst. The sisters drank gratefully, their manners polite but dignified. Even in this small act, a subtle exchange took place. The hermit's suspicion softened, replaced with a cautious curiosity. He observed them carefully, noting the resilience in their movements, the ease with which they adapted to his sparse environment. This moment marked a turning point. The rigid walls of his self-imposed isolation, which had protected him for so many years, began to show cracks. The sisters' presence, though brief and seemingly ordinary, introduced a new dynamic, one that promised to disrupt the routine of his solitary life. As they finished drinking and looked around his homestead with quiet interest, the hermit felt a stirring he hadn't experienced in years, a mixture of intrigue, unease, and perhaps even the first glimmer of hope that human connection might once again enter his life. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the hermit had made a choice. He would allow these strangers, these imposing yet strangely approachable Apache sisters, into his life, at least for a short while. What he did not know, however, was that their arrival would not be fleeting. Their presence would begin a chain of events that would challenge his solitude, test his trust, and ultimately reshape the course of his life in ways he could never have anticipated. The initial relief of quenching thirst slowly gave way to a complex atmosphere in the hermit's home. Though the Apache sisters had proven themselves polite and respectful, Their presence disrupted the meticulous order he had maintained for decades. The quiet, controlled rhythm of his life, where every movement, every task, and every meal was carefully orchestrated, now faced a new element: unpredictable human interaction. The sisters moved with ease around his homestead, touching nothing without purpose but observing everything with keen interest. Their confidence contrasted sharply with his cautious, measured approach, creating a subtle tension that was impossible to ignore. Despite the tension, there was also curiosity. The hermit found himself studying their mannerisms, the way the taller sister's eyes would sweep over the horizon, always alert, and the quieter sister's subtle gestures, her fingers brushing over the simple tools and utensils as if assessing their use. They carried themselves with a grace born of experience, yet there was an undeniable warmth beneath their imposing exterior. Slowly, he began to realize that they were not ordinary travelers. They were survivors, much like himself, shaped by hardship and yet unbroken. The sisters, for their part, were equally observant. They recognized the hermit's initial wariness, noting the careful way he positioned himself near his doorway, the way he measured their movements with an almost instinctive caution. They did not rush him, nor did they press for conversation. Instead, they offered small acts of engagement, sharing food they had carried, commenting on the desert landscape, or laughing softly at minor mishaps during chores. Each act, while seemingly mundane, became a test of trust, a bridge slowly being built between strangers. Conversations began tentatively. The hermit, usually silent for days on end, found himself answering questions short, clipped sentences at first, then gradually expanding into stories of his life in the desert. He spoke of the long years alone, of the routines that had become both his solace and his prison, and of the moments when loneliness pressed so heavily that he doubted anyone could ever truly understand him. In response, the sisters shared fragments of their own journey tales of wandering across harsh landscapes, of challenges faced and overcome, and of the bond between them as sisters. There was an honesty in their voices, a natural trust in one another that the hermit had long forgotten existed among humans. Yet tension remained. The hermit was wary of intentions. Why had they come to him of all places? Were they seeking refuge from something, or simply passing through? His instincts, honed by decades of solitude, urged him to maintain distance, to protect the delicate equilibrium of his life. The sisters sensed this, and rather than pushing, respected it. Their patience became a silent negotiation. They would remain guests without overstepping, and he would grant them space while assessing whether this intrusion could coexist with his solitary world. Over several days, trust began to form in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The sisters helped with small chores, collecting firewood, repairing a leaky roof, or assisting in tending the garden. Each act was simple, yet each carried a weight of connection, a silent promise that they were allies, not threats. In turn, the hermit began to show small gestures of openness, sharing tools, offering water without hesitation, and even allowing them into the inner sanctum of his home. A space previously forbidden to outsiders. Now a fragile yet undeniable bond had emerged. The tension of the initial encounter had not vanished, but it had evolved into a cautious partnership, a delicate balance of respect, curiosity, and nascent trust. The hermit realized that while his solitude had been a shield, it was also a barrier that kept him from experiencing life's fuller possibilities. The sisters, in turn, had shown that even in a stranger's presence, one could offer loyalty, courage, and companionship. The understanding that this new arrangement of shared space and careful interaction was only the beginning. The hermit had taken the first step toward reopening his heart, and the sisters had planted the seeds of trust. What lay ahead would challenge both their skills and their patience. but it also promised the extraordinary transformation that solitude alone could never provide. Asterisk, as days turned into weeks, the fragile bond between the hermit and the two Apache sisters began to grow stronger, evolving from cautious curiosity into genuine companionship. What had started as a practical act, offering water to weary travelers, transformed into a rhythm of shared labor, laughter, and mutual respect. The hermit, who had spent decades in the desert alone, slowly discovered that the presence of the sisters was not merely a disruption but a profound enrichment of his life. The sisters proved invaluable in ways he had not anticipated. The taller sister, with her commanding presence and decisive movements, took charge of organizing daily tasks. She helped fortify the small homestead, arranging firewood efficiently, repairing worn structures, and ensuring the water troughs were properly maintained. The quieter sister, calm and observant, assisted in delicate chores, teaching the hermit techniques for preserving food, tracking animals, and harvesting desert plants more effectively. Their skills were complementary, and together they demonstrated a mastery of survival that impressed the hermit, who realized that he, for all his experience, had become somewhat rigid and limited in his methods over the years. Through their shared labor, the trio also shared knowledge. The hermit taught the sisters what he had learned over decades of solitude: how to locate hidden water sources beneath the sands, how to anticipate the desert's weather shifts, and how to read animal tracks to predict movement and behavior. In turn, the sisters introduced new ideas he had never considered: ways to cook food using minimal resources, methods for constructing simple yet durable shelters, and strategies for moving silently and efficiently through the terrain. Each lesson, exchanged in humility and patience, strengthened both practical survival and emotional connection, yet bonding was not limited to work alone. Small moments of intimacy, sitting by the fire at dusk, sharing stories of the past, laughing at small mishaps, gradually softened the hermit's guarded heart. The taller sister spoke of her childhood, of journeys taken across vast landscapes with her sister, and the challenges they had faced together. The quieter sister shared subtle reflections on life, resilience, and the importance of trusting those who prove themselves worthy. In these stories, the hermit saw glimpses of experiences he had once known but had long buried under layers of solitude. He found himself smiling more freely, listening more attentively, and even feeling a sense of belonging he had thought impossible. Their bond was also tested in small, everyday trials. The desert was unforgiving, and simple tasks often required cooperation. A sudden sandstorm forced them to work together, securing the homestead and ensuring that water and food supplies were protected. Each act of collaboration, each shared struggle, deepened trust and fostered a sense of family in a place that had long known only loneliness. The hermit began to recognize that vulnerability could coexist with strength. By allowing others into his life, he was not weakening himself but growing stronger, more adaptable, and more connected to the world around him. The trio had settled into a comfortable rhythm of mutual support and understanding. The sisters had become integral to the hermit's daily life, their presence a steady source of companionship and guidance. Equally, he had earned their respect through his knowledge, patience, and quiet resilience. The desert, once a realm of isolation and harsh survival, now pulsed with warmth, shared laughter, and learning. The hermit's life, once strictly defined by solitude and routine, had begun to embrace change and connection. The bond formed through shared lessons, work, and vulnerability laid the foundation for deeper trust and mutual respect. It was no longer simply about survival, it was about living fully, opening oneself to others, and discovering that even in the most desolate places, relationships could flourish and transform a lifelong thought complete in its isolation. Life in the desert had found a tentative rhythm, a fragile harmony built on trust, shared labor, and growing companionship. The hermit, once rigid and wary, now allowed himself to relax in the presence of the two Apache sisters, enjoying the warmth of human connection that had long been absent from his life. Yet, even in the quietest corners of the desert, danger was never far away. The fragile peace they had built was about to be tested, forcing them to confront threats not only to their physical survival, but to the trust and bonds they had begun to forge. It started subtly. Dust clouds appeared on the horizon, moving faster than the usual windstorms, accompanied by distant shouts carried by the dry air. The hermit's instincts, honed by decades of solitary survival, immediately went on high alert. He recognized the signs of a potential intrusion, the sounds of horses, voices, and hurried movement that suggested a band of strangers approaching with uncertain intent. The sisters, equally perceptive, moved without hesitation. Their calm, coordinated response demonstrated their years of experience traveling harsh terrains and facing dangers that demanded quick thinking and cooperation. The intruders proved to be a group of desert raiders, seeking resources and ready to take what they wanted by force. The hermit, who had always relied solely on his own skills and intuition, now realized that survival required unity. The sisters instinctively positioned themselves alongside him, their presence both a reassurance and a challenge to his self-imposed independence. The tense standoff forced him to adapt, relying not just on his knowledge of the land, but also on the sisters' insights into human behavior and strategy. Their combined skills created a formidable defense, turning his modest homestead into a stronghold. Despite its simplicity, the confrontation was as much psychological as it was physical. The bandits tested boundaries, shouting demands and attempting intimidation, yet the hermit and the sisters held their ground. The taller sister's commanding voice issued clear warnings, while the quieter sister moved with precision, anticipating threats and protecting weak points in their defenses. Together, they demonstrated that strength was not measured solely by numbers or weapons, but by strategy, unity, and courage. For the hermit, this was a revelation. He had long relied only on himself, but survival in the face of real danger now demanded trust and cooperation. As the threat escalated, small acts of bravery became crucial. The hermit rigged simple traps and created diversions using his intimate knowledge of the terrain. The sisters coordinated these efforts, signaling each other with subtle gestures and silently executing maneuvers that showcased their skill and trust in one another. The desert, which had once been his solitary domain, became a stage for teamwork, highlighting the transformation in the hermit's life. He realized that the bonds formed over shared tasks, trust, and lessons were not just emotional, they were practical, life-saving and unbreakable under pressure. After a tense, grueling confrontation, the bandits were forced to retreat, unable to overcome the combined ingenuity and resolve of the trio. The hermit, exhausted but unbroken, felt a profound sense of gratitude and awe. The sisters had proven themselves indispensable, not just as companions, but as allies capable of facing danger with skill, intelligence, and courage. He saw, in stark relief, the contrast between the isolation of his past and the power of connection in the present. The crisis had tested their limits, but it had also strengthened the bonds of trust and friendship, leaving the hermit profoundly changed. The desert, once a place of loneliness and survival, now stood as a symbol of shared resilience. The hermit's solitude, which had defined his life for decades, had been transformed by the presence of the sisters into a space of collaboration, mutual protection, and emotional growth. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that life's true richness was not in isolation, but in the courage to trust and rely on others even in the harshest, most unforgiving environments. After the confrontation with the desert raiders, the once isolated hermit experienced a transformation that went beyond mere survival. The crisis had cemented a bond between him and the two Apache sisters, revealing the profound strength of trust, cooperation, and companionship. Where once the desert had been a barren, silent world reflecting his inner solitude, it now resonated with life, shared experiences, and a newfound sense of purpose. The hermit, who had endured decades of isolation, began to see that the richness of life lay not in solitude, but in the connections forged through adversity, empathy, and understanding. In the days following the threat, the trio settled into a deeper rhythm. The sisters helped him expand his homestead, fortifying his shelter and improving water storage. Each task became a shared effort, not just a practical necessity but a symbol of their growing partnership. The hermit, once fiercely protective of his routines and his space, learned to delegate and to accept help without suspicion. Laughter returned to the homestead, filling the quiet corners that had been dominated by years of silence. Even small moments, like sharing a meal or watching the sunset together, took on profound significance, reminders that life was richer when experienced with others. Emotionally, the hermit underwent a subtle yet profound change. The sisters' presence encouraged him to confront the layers of loneliness he had accumulated over decades. He realized that his solitude had been both a shield and a prison, protecting him from disappointment while simultaneously limiting his capacity for connection. Through shared stories, gentle humor, and moments of vulnerability, he rediscovered the value of trust and the courage to let others into his life. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to feel hope, warmth, and a tentative sense of belonging. The sisters, too, were changed. Though they had arrived seeking only water and temporary respite, they found a home in the desert hermit's life. They had demonstrated their strength, resilience, and intelligence during the bandit confrontation, earning not only their survival but the deep respect and friendship of the man they had once considered a stranger. Their journey, initially defined by necessity and survival, evolved into a partnership of mutual support and shared purpose. Each of them contributed something vital: courage, knowledge, empathy, and the ability to see value in connection even amidst harsh circumstances. As the sun rose and set over the endless dunes, the hermit realized that his world had expanded. He had learned that strength alone, physical skill, survival instincts, or rugged independence was insufficient for a fulfilling life. True strength came from relationships, trust, and the willingness to open one's heart to the unexpected. The desert, once a symbol of isolation, now represented possibility, growth, and the intertwining of human lives against the backdrop of a harsh but beautiful landscape. Eventually, the sisters prepared to continue their journey. Though the hermit would miss their constant presence, he understood that life's richness was not measured by permanence, but by the impact of shared experiences. Their time together had transformed him, leaving him with skills, insights, and most importantly, the capacity to embrace connection rather than fear it. He knew that the door of his homestead, once shut for decades, would no longer remain closed. It was now open, a testament to trust and the enduring human need for companionship. The hermit, who had lived alone for a lifetime, now carried within him the lessons, warmth, and courage of the two Apache sisters. Though they would eventually leave, their impact was indelible, and he was no longer the man defined solely by solitude. The story closes with a sense of possibility, a once isolated life transformed through trust, resilience, and the unexpected arrival of two travelers who, in seeking water, had given him the gift of connection, companionship, and a new beginning in the desert that had long been his solitary world.